The autumn sunlight glinted off the brass buttons of Lieutenant Malcolm Reynolds' scarlet tunic as he walked through London's legal district. His polished boots echoed against the pavement with each precise step, creating a steady rhythm that matched his disciplined thoughts. After 7 years with the King's Guard, the weight of his bearskin cap, a full 13 inches tall, had long ceased to register in his consciousness. Checking his watch, a simple, sturdy timepiece that had been his father's, Reynolds noted he had 90 minutes until his ceremonial duty at Buckingham Palace. His route today took him past the Old Bailey, and the magnificent building with its golden Lady Justice statue had always fascinated him. Perhaps it was the shared sense of tradition between the legal system and military ceremony that drew him to both worlds. Reynolds had grown up between these institutions. His father a respected barrister, his grandfather a decorated military officer. Few of his fellow guardsmen knew about his legal education. He kept that part of himself private, finding satisfaction in simply serving without showcasing his credentials. "Plenty of time," he murmured to himself, slowing his pace as he approached the courthouse steps. A public hearing was in session about a property dispute he'd read about in yesterday's paper. His interest in law wasn't merely casual. Before joining the Guard, he'd harbored ambitions in that direction. Several passers-by slowed their hurried London pace as they noticed him. An elderly man with a veteran's pin on his lapel caught Reynolds' eye and offered a crisp salute, which Reynolds returned with perfect precision. "Going on duty, lad?" the veteran asked. "Not for another hour and a half, sir," Reynolds replied with a slight smile. "Thought I might observe the Webster hearing inside." The veteran nodded approvingly. "Educational use of your time. Carry on." As Reynolds climbed the courthouse steps, he felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with the uniform. Even off duty, he represented something larger than himself, a tradition of discipline and service stretching back centuries. The heavy oak doors of Courtroom 6 opened silently under Reynolds' white-gloved hand. Inside, the wood-paneled room buzzed with the subdued energy of legal proceedings in progress. Reynolds slipped in with military efficiency, his movements precise but quiet as he sought to minimize disruption. Despite his care, the vibrant scarlet of his uniform created a stark contrast against the courtroom's muted palette. At the bench sat Judge Harold Blackwood, a man whose reputation preceded him in legal circles, currently presiding over what appeared to be the final stages of a property dispute. His resonant voice filled the chamber as he questioned the plaintiff's counsel. "And you expect this court to believe," Blackwood was saying, his words carrying the practiced projection of a man who enjoyed the sound of his own authority, "that your client was unaware of the easement despite it being clearly documented in the original deed?" The solicitor shifted uncomfortably. "My client maintains that the document provided during the sale did not." Yes, Blackwood interrupted with a dismissive wave. "We've heard that particular claim already." His eyes swept the courtroom with satisfaction, clearly relishing his command of the proceedings. Reynolds located an empty seat in the back row and maneuvered into it with minimal disturbance. Still, the crimson uniform inevitably drew attention. Soon a subtle wave of whispers and turned heads rippled through the gallery. Judge Blackwood, deep into his monologue, suddenly realized he'd lost his audience. His voice trailed off as he followed the collective gaze to the scarlet-uniformed figure sitting quietly in the back row. "Is there?" Blackwood asked, his voice cutting through the silence with deliberate precision. "Something of interest occurring in the gallery that supersedes the matter before this court?" The question hung in the air, aimed unmistakably at the guardsman whose presence had disrupted the carefully cultivated atmosphere. The sharp crack of his gavel silenced the murmurs. "May I ask," Blackwood began, his voice dripping with thinly veiled contempt, "why a costumed performer has decided it appropriate to disrupt my courtroom in the middle of proceedings?" Reynolds remained still for a moment, then rose to his feet with military precision. "Your Honor," he responded, his voice clear but respectful. "Lieutenant Malcolm Reynolds of the King's Guard. I am attending as an interested citizen during my off-duty hours." The judge's eyebrows rose dramatically. An interested citizen who chose to attend in full theatrical regalia rather than civilian attire. Interesting interpretation of courtroom decorum, Lieutenant. "The uniform is standard duty attire, Your Honor," Reynolds explained evenly. "I am due at my post at Buckingham Palace directly after this hearing." Blackwood scoffed audibly. "And you couldn't have found time to change between engagements? Or perhaps the spectacle of appearing in costume was part of your intention in coming here today?" A silver-haired barrister in the front row cleared his throat. "Your Honor, perhaps we might return to the Westbury property matter." "One moment." Mr. Harrington Blackwood cut him off without taking his eyes off Reynolds. "The dignity of this court is my primary concern. When someone enters my courtroom dressed for a tourist photo opportunity, it undermines the serious nature of these proceedings." Reynolds stood at perfect attention. "Your Honor, with respect, this is a public hearing. Citizens are permitted to observe regardless of profession or attire, provided their conduct remains non-disruptive." Blackwood's face flushed slightly. "I'm well aware of the public nature of these proceedings, Lieutenant. I've only been presiding over them for 27 years. His sarcasm drew uncomfortable glances from the legal professionals present. "What you seem unaware of," the judge continued, leaning forward, "is that this courtroom operates under specific decorum requirements. Section 42 of Courtroom Procedural Standards clearly prohibits attire that creates distraction or disruption." The elderly solicitor in the front row furrowed his brow at this citation, exchanging a puzzled glance with his colleague. Judge Blackwood pushed himself to his feet, looming over the courtroom. "In my 30 years on this bench," he announced, "I have never witnessed such blatant disrespect for these proceedings. The uniform of the King's Guard belongs on palace grounds and ceremonial routes, not in a court of law where serious matters are being decided. This isn't a tourist attraction." Lieutenant Set. Several spectators exchanged uncomfortable glances. The property dispute sat forgotten, its participants watching the unfolding drama with confusion and concern. "Section 42 of Courtroom Procedural Standards," Blackwood repeated with emphasis, "explicitly prohibits performance attire in judicial settings." He thumped a thick legal volume on the bench for emphasis, though he made no move to open it to the purported section. Reynolds remained composed. "Your Honor, with respect, there is no prohibition against military uniforms in any courtroom standard I'm aware of. You presume to lecture me on court procedure." Blackwood cut him off sharply. "I determine what is and isn't appropriate in my courtroom. Soldier, not you." The dismissive tone with which he said soldier carried unmistakable disdain. "What we have here," the judge continued, "is a clear case of someone using theatrical dress to draw attention to themselves in my courtroom. I wonder, Lieutenant, do you find your actual duties so lacking in substance that you need to seek validation by disrupting legal proceedings?" Reynolds remained perfectly composed, though the slightest tightening around his eyes suggested the insult had registered. "I'm here to observe the application of civil procedure in a property dispute, Your Honor. Nothing more." "Playing dress-up while you do it," Blackwood scoffed. "Tell me, does the palace know you're using their costume to seek attention elsewhere?" Judge Blackwood shuffled papers before him with theatricality. "Lieutenant, if that is indeed your rank," he began. "Infusing the title with skepticism, you leave me no choice in this matter." He straightened to his full height. "For willful disruption of court proceedings and inappropriate attire in a judicial setting, I am imposing a fine of £2,000 to be paid within 14 days. A ripple of disbelief ran through the courtroom. The amount was wildly disproportionate for any procedural violation, let alone one so clearly manufactured. Additionally, Blackwood continued, I am citing you for uniform violation in a judicial setting, contra Section 38 of the Courthouse Attendance Regulations. Two junior barristers near the back exchanged alarmed glances. One whispered, There is no Section 38. He's completely overreaching. Reynolds stood perfectly still throughout this pronouncement. When the judge paused, he spoke. Your Honor, I respectfully request permission to address the court regarding this matter. You've said quite enough. Lieutenant, Blackwood replied dismissively. The fine stands. Court security will provide you with the necessary documentation on your way out. He made a shooing motion with his hand. From the front row, the senior barrister rose to his feet. Your Honor, if I might speak to a point of procedure, basic procedural fairness requires that the lieutenant be permitted to respond before penalties are imposed. It's a fundamental principle of natural justice. Other legal professionals nodded in agreement. Blackwood glanced around, suddenly aware his behavior had crossed into potentially reviewable territory. Very well, he conceded with poor grace. Lieutenant Reynolds may make a brief statement, though I doubt it will alter the outcome. Reynolds stepped forward into the center aisle with measured precision. He came to attention, removed his bearskin cap, and tucked it properly under his left arm in accordance with military protocol. The simple dignity of the movement stood in sharp contrast to the judge's theatrical displays. The courtroom fell completely silent. Even those who had been whispering turned their full attention to the scarlet uniformed figure, now standing in perfect military bearing before the bench. Thank you, Your Honor, Reynolds began, his voice clear and steady. I must respectfully correct several factual and legal errors in Your Honor's assessment. First, regarding public attendance at court hearings. The Court Access Act of 1981, Section 4. Paragraph 2 explicitly states that no citizen shall be barred from observing public court proceedings based on profession, attire, or appearance, provided their conduct remains non-disruptive. Reynolds quoted the statute verbatim without hesitation. The Act further clarifies in paragraph 3 that military personnel in uniform are explicitly permitted to observe proceedings during off-duty hours. This provision was added following Maurice v. Sutton District Court 1979, where a naval officer was improperly removed from a public hearing. Reynolds reached into his tunic pocket and produced a small, well-worn legal reference book. I have the relevant sections here if the court wishes to verify the citation. Regarding the Section 42 of Courtroom Procedural Standards that Your Honor cited, Reynolds continued, I must note that the standards contain only 37 sections as revised last year. There is no Section 42. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Similarly, the Section 38 of Courthouse Attendance Regulations, mentioned in connection with the fine, does not exist in any current legal framework governing British courts. Judge Blackwood shifted in his seat, color rising in his cheeks. While the specific section numbers may differ from my recollection, he interjected, the principle remains. With respect, Your Honor, Reynolds continued calmly, the principle does not remain, as no such prohibitions exist in any form. The Judicial Administration Act of 2005 specifically prohibited arbitrary dress codes for public attendees at open court sessions following several cases where judges had attempted to impose personal preferences as legal requirements. As to the matter of the fine itself, Reynolds said, his pace measured. The Judicial Penalties Act of 2007, Section 14 explicitly limits monetary sanctions to instances of actual disruption, defined as behavior that tangibly impedes the function of the court. My silent observation from the public gallery does not meet this standard. Judge Blackwood's hand, which had been reaching for his water glass, paused in mid-air. You seem remarkably well versed in legal matters for a ceremonial guard, Lieutenant, he observed, attempting to regain footing. That brings me to an important point of clarification. Reynolds replied, his posture remaining perfectly formal. At this point I should perhaps explain my background to provide context for my observations. He stood at perfect military attention, the scarlet tunic adding gravity to his words. Before joining the King's Guard 5 years ago, I completed my law degree at Cambridge University, graduating with first-class honors and specializing in administrative and constitutional law. Audible gasps emerged from several points in the gallery. Judge Blackwood's face drained of color. I practiced for 3 years with Harrington, Whitfield, and Associates, focusing primarily on cases involving procedural justice and administrative overreach. Currently, I'm completing a part-time master's degree in legal history through King's College London, with particular focus on the evolution of courtroom access rights. The court reporter's fingers flew across her machine, capturing every word of the extraordinary revelation. This background informs my assessment of today's proceedings, Reynolds continued calmly. In particular, I would direct the court's attention to Andrews v. Judicial Services Commission 2014, where Justice Whitmore wrote that the imposition of arbitrary fines based on a judge's personal discomfort rather than actual disruption constitutes a profound misapplication of judicial authority. Decharacterization of military dress uniform as costume or theatrical dress also raises concerns beyond mere inaccuracy. In Martins v. Bedford Crown Court 2008, the Appellate Division ruled that judicial disparagement of military service constitutes improper conduct worthy of review. Justice Lawrence specifically noted that the uniform represents service to the Crown and nation, demanding the same respect in legal settings that judges expect for their own robes. Judge Blackwood's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the bench. In summary, Reynolds concluded, his posture and tone remaining respectful despite the devastating legal critique, the fine imposed is without legal foundation, based on non-existent regulations, and imposed in response to permitted conduct. The characterization of my uniform and presence represents a significant departure from established legal norms regarding military personnel and public court access. Judge Blackwood cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent courtroom. His fingers adjusted his robes in a transparent attempt to regain composure. In light of the additional information presented, he began carefully, avoiding any acknowledgement of error. This court will reconsider the matter of the fine. He shuffled papers needlessly. The citation is hereby withdrawn, and no penalty will be assessed. Thank you, Your Honor, Reynolds said. However, with respect, a formal correction to the record would be appropriate given the nature of the exchange. The court clerk slid a discreet note onto the judge's bench. Blackwood glanced at it, his lips tightening briefly before he spoke again. The record will reflect that Lieutenant Reynolds was within his rights to attend these proceedings and that no violation of court protocol occurred. The words emerged stiffly. Furthermore, he added after another glance at the clerk's note, the court acknowledges that previous characterizations of the lieutenant's uniform were inappropriate. The King's Guard represents a distinguished tradition of service to the Crown. Reynolds nodded once, accepting the grudging apology with military dignity. Thank you, Your Honor. I appreciate the court's reconsideration. He prepared to depart when the judge's gavel stopped him. Lieutenant Blackwood called, making one final attempt to salvage his authority. While your legal knowledge is admittedly impressive, in future court appearances perhaps consider that military presence can be distracting in civilian proceedings. Reynolds turned back, facing the bench directly. Your Honor, the uniform I wear represents hundreds of years of service and sacrifice. The law you administer promises equal access to justice for all citizens, regardless of profession. These traditions are not in conflict. They reinforce each other. A society that respects both will be stronger for it. The simple eloquence of this statement resonated through the courtroom. Several spectators nodded in agreement, including the elderly barrister who had spoken earlier. "The court appreciates your perspective, Lieutenant," Blackwood conceded, recognizing further argument would only diminish him further. "You are free to remain for the proceedings, or depart as your duties require." Reynolds checked his watch with military precision. "Thank you, Your Honor. I should report for my post. I apologize for any unintended disruption to today's hearing." With that final courtesy, an apology everyone present knew was unnecessary, Reynolds replaced his bearskin cap with perfect form and executed a precise military turn toward the exit. His departure was as composed and dignified as his defense had been, each step measured and exact against the wooden floor. In the lobby, Reynolds found the elderly veteran who had saluted him earlier waiting by the entrance. The old soldier came to attention as best his aged frame allowed and offered another salute. "Saw the whole thing through the door," the veteran said quietly. "Reminded them what it means to wear the uniform. You did. Well done, son." Reynolds returned the salute with perfect form. "Thank you, sir. Just did what was necessary." He checked his watch again. Still sufficient time to reach his post at Buckingham Palace. As he descended the courthouse steps, his bearing remained perfectly military, shoulders square, head high. The encounter had not altered his composure or his schedule, discipline maintained in the face of both injustice and vindication.